Imagine waking up one morning to discover that a silent hand has reached into your wallet overnight, taken a portion of your earnings, and left without breaking a single law, without sending you a bill, and without ever asking for your consent. Then imagine realizing that this happens every year of your life, in every country on earth, is that most people not only tolerate it, but are taught to believe it is necessary, benevolent, even normal. Because that unsettling realization is the mystery at the heart of today's video. Why inflation, something described in textbooks as a mild economic phenomenon or a policy tool, may actually be the most legalized form of theft in modern history, hiding in plain sight while reshaping societies, destroying savings, and transferring wealth on a scale that dwarfs most crimes we loudly condemn. To understand how we got here, we need to rewind to a time when money itself meant something tangible, when a coin represented a specific weight of precious metal, and governments were constrained by physical limits. Because inflation is not a law of nature, but a human invention born from power, war, and political convenience. Stretching back thousands of years to ancient rulers who discovered that quietly reducing the silver content of coins was far easier than openly raising taxes, a trick perfected by the Roman Empire when emperors like Nero shaved precious metals off denarius coins to fund military campaigns and lavish spending, setting off price increases, social unrest, and ultimately contributing to imperial decline. An early warning that manipulating money carries long-term consequences, even if it solves short-term problems. Fast forward centuries and the same pattern repeats in more sophisticated forms as banking systems evolve. Paper money emerges, and central authorities realize that control over currency equals control over the economy. With key figures like John Maynard Keynes arguing during the chaos of the Great Depression that governments needed the flexibility to manage demand, stimulate growth, and smooth economic cycles. Ideas that would later justify permanent inflation targets. While critics like Friedrich Hayek warned that removing money from market discipline would lead to moral hazard, unchecked power, and hidden redistribution. A debate that quietly shaped the modern financial system we now take for granted. The true origins of modern inflation crystallized in the 20th century, especially during wartime when governments abandoned gold standards to print money at scale, financing conflicts without directly taxing citizens, because inflation spreads the cost invisibly across society. And nowhere is this clearer than in the aftermath of World War I, when Germany's Weimar Republic printed money to pay reparations, triggering hyperinflation so extreme that workers were paid twice a day and wheelbarrows of cash couldn't buy bread. A dramatic case that shows inflation is not just rising prices, but the collapse of trust in money itself. Yet instead of learning the full lesson, the world doubled down. And the next major turning point came in 1971, when US President Richard Nixon closed the gold window, severing the dollar's final link to gold and ushering in the era of pure fiat currency. A moment often framed as technical or temporary, but which fundamentally changed the nature of money by removing external limits on its creation, allowing central banks to expand the money supply indefinitely under the promise of responsible management, a promise that sounds reassuring until you follow the cause and effect chain. Once money can be created at will, political incentives shift, because printing currency is easier than cutting spending or raising taxes. And over time, this leads to a steady erosion of purchasing power, with official inflation targets of 2% sounding small, until you realize that over 30 years, this quietly halves the value of money, meaning that savings accounts, pensions, and wages lose real value unless they constantly outrun inflation, a race most people are mathematically destined to lose.
Ow.
As inflation rises gradually, feels manageable, but the breaking point arrives when external shocks expose the fragility of the system, such as oil. Crises in the 1970s, financial meltdowns in 2008, or global pandemics that prompt unprecedented stimulus, and each time the response is the same: more money creation to save the economy, which stabilizes markets in the short term, but plants the seeds for future inflation. A delayed effect that often hits years later, ensuring that the architects of the policy are rarely the ones blamed for its consequences. The fallout is uneven and deeply political, because inflation does not affect everyone equally. It punishes savers, fixed income earners, and the poor, while benefiting debtors, asset owners, and those closest to newly created money, a phenomenon known as the Cantillon effect, where banks, corporations and governments spend fresh money before prices rise, while ordinary people face higher costs later without higher incomes, effectively transferring wealth upward through a mechanism few fully understand. Governments attempt fixes, price controls, interest rate hikes, wage policies, but history shows these are often temporary band-aids that treat symptoms rather than causes, with price controls leading to shortages, aggressive rate hikes triggering recessions, and stimulus cycles creating dependency. All while the underlying incentive to inflate remains intact, because modern states are built on debt that becomes harder to service without eroding currency value. When we connect this story to modern parallels, the scale becomes shocking. In many countries, over 80% of all money in existence was created in the last 2 decades. Housing prices have outpaced wages by multiples, and what once took a single income to afford now requires 2 or 3. Not because people suddenly became less productive, but because money itself became cheaper. The same repeating pattern appears everywhere. Inflation accelerates first denial, then blame shifting, then normalization until people accept lower living standards as inevitable rather than engineered. This is why inflation can be described as legalized theft. It transfers purchasing power without explicit consent, operates through policy rather than crime, and relies on complexity and time delay to avoid accountability, making it uniquely effective and socially tolerated, even defended by those who believe there is no alternative. Despite historical reminders that monetary discipline, transparency, and limits once existed and could exist again in different forms. So what are the takeaways from this long, uncomfortable story? First, inflation is not just an economic statistic, but a political choice with winners and losers. And understanding who benefits is crucial to understanding why it persists. Second, protecting yourself requires more than working harder, requires financial literacy, asset diversification, and awareness of how monetary systems shape incentives. And third, the most dangerous aspect of inflation is not sudden collapse, but slow normalization, where people adapt to decline without ever questioning its cause. The warning is simple, but unsettling. Systems that rely on hidden extraction eventually face trust crises. And when trust in money breaks, history shows the consequences are swift and severe. So the open-ended question is whether we will recognize the pattern in time or repeat it once again under new names and new promises. And if you want to keep questioning the stories you're told about money, power, and history, consider subscribing. Because the most important things shaping your future are often the ones happening quietly in the background.